Kuan never warned loudly. When he sounded an alarm, it was measured, deliberate, and therefore unsettling. He believed that the most serious dangers confronting advanced societies were rarely dramatic. They arrived quietly, embedded in incentives, habits, and assumptions that no longer matched reality. If he were asked to assess the shared future of Australia and New Zealand, his concern would not be about immediate crisis. It would be about trajectory, about two successful, comfortable societies drifting together into a future where their relative weight, relevance, and capacity quietly diminish. He would begin by acknowledging their achievements. Both countries are stable democracies. Both enjoy high living standards. Their institutions function. Their societies are cohesive by global standards. Their international reputations are positive. These are not trivial accomplishments. Lee respected them. But he would then pose the question he always asked of prosperous societies. Are you mistaking stability for competitiveness? In Lee's framework, geography offers no permanent shelter. Distance delays pressure. It does not remove it. Australia and New Zealand have long benefited from geographic isolation, strong alliances, and benign strategic environments. These advantages bought time. Time, Lee would warn, is often squandered by societies that assume it is endless. He believed that small and mid-sized countries face a particular risk when they are successful. They optimize for comfort rather than performance. Political systems evolve to preserve consensus. Economic systems evolve to distribute rather than transform. Over time, reform becomes negotiable instead of necessary. When reform is optional, it is postponed. Australia and New Zealand, in his view, share this vulnerability. Their political cultures prize fairness, balance, and social harmony. These are virtues. But Lee would argue that virtues without discipline can become liabilities. When every interest must be accommodated, no strategy is fully executed. Execution diluted becomes underperformance. He would focus sharply on productivity. Productivity, he believed, is the clearest signal of a society's future competitiveness. Both Australia and New Zealand have struggled with productivity growth relative to peers. High commodity revenues in Australia and lifestyle attractiveness in New Zealand mask this weakness. Masking is dangerous because it delays correction. Lee would emphasize that population growth and resource income inflate aggregate numbers without improving per capita capability. What matters is not how large the economy becomes, but how capable the average worker, institution, and firm becomes relative to global competitors. On this measure, both countries risk falling behind more adaptive systems. He would also examine talent flows. Australia and New Zealand educate capable people, but they struggle to retain and concentrate them. Talent density, not talent volume, was central to Lee's thinking. World-class outcomes emerge when skilled individuals cluster tightly, exchange ideas rapidly, and scale quickly. Distance, fragmented markets, and modest domestic scale work against this. In his view, both countries risk becoming exporters of talent rather than hubs of it. Lifestyle alone cannot compete indefinitely with opportunity, scale, and ambition. When the most driven individuals leave to pursue larger ecosystems, domestic innovation slows. This is not collapse, it is leakage. Leakage compounds silently. Lee would also warn about over-reliance on alliances. Alliances are valuable, but they are strongest when partners are indispensable. Strategic relevance must be earned continuously. Australia and New Zealand often assume that shared values guarantee enduring strategic importance. Lee would caution that values attract sympathy, not necessity. Necessity comes from capability. He would argue that both countries risk outsourcing strategic thinking to larger partners. Security is assumed. Markets are assumed. Stability is assumed. Assumptions are dangerous because they delay preparation. When the external environment hardens, adjustment becomes costly. Another shared vulnerability Lee would identify is short political time horizons. Democracies respond to voters. Voters reward stability. Leaders proposing disruptive reform face backlash. Over time, systems evolve to manage decline rather than prevent it. Lee believed leadership exists precisely to act before decline is felt. He would stress that decline is relative. Australia and New Zealand may remain prosperous, peaceful, and admired, but others will move faster. Capital will find higher returns elsewhere. Innovation will concentrate in denser ecosystems. Influence will shift. Remaining comfortable is not the same as remaining relevant. Lee would also highlight the danger of complacent comparison. Both countries often measure themselves against struggling states rather than against the most adaptive ones. This lowers ambition. The correct benchmark, Lee insisted, is the fastest improvers, not the weakest performers. Importantly, he would not predict catastrophe. His alarm would be strategic, not apocalyptic. He would argue that the shared future of Australia and New Zealand depends on whether they rediscover urgency without crisis. whether they are willing to disrupt comfortable systems in order to compete in a harsher, faster moving world. He would likely urge them to think regionally as well as nationally. Separately, each faces limits of scale. Together, they could deepen integration in skills, capital, infrastructure, and innovation. But integration requires political will and long-term vision, both difficult to sustain without pressure. Lee would conclude with a familiar warning. The most dangerous moment for successful societies is when they believe their success is self-sustaining. History, he would say, does not punish countries for being immoral. It punishes them for being slow. Australia and New Zealand still have time. But time, in Kuan Yew's thinking, is valuable only if used. If not, it quietly runs out. That is the alarm he would sound, not of impending failure, but of a narrowing future shaped by choices not yet made. Kuan Yew would continue by stressing that the danger facing Australia and New Zealand is amplified by how similar their trajectories have become. When two neighboring societies share the same strengths, they often share the same blind spots. Both countries benefit from rule of law, social trust, and political legitimacy. Both also suffer from limited scale, geographic distance from major growth centers, and political cultures that resist sustained disruption. Similar systems tend to reinforce each other's assumptions rather than challenge them. He would argue that their shared future is being shaped less by external shocks than by internal habits. Habits form slowly, invisibly, and with good intentions. Once embedded, they are difficult to reverse. Australia and New Zealand have developed habits of incrementalism, small adjustments instead of structural reform. Incrementalism works well in stable environments. It fails in competitive ones. Lee believed that the global environment has already shifted into a far more competitive phase. Capital is mobile, talent is selective, technology compresses advantage quickly. In such conditions, societies that rely on gradualism lose ground to those willing to make decisive, sometimes uncomfortable changes. He would warn that both Australia and New Zealand still behave as if time is forgiving. He would also focus on the way public debate is framed. In both countries, economic and strategic discussions are often reduced to questions of fairness and distribution rather than capability and performance. Lee did not dismiss fairness, but he insisted it must follow productivity, not precede it. Distributing stagnation evenly does not prevent decline, it merely conceals it. From his perspective, both societies increasingly treat growth as something that should happen naturally, rather than something that must be engineered deliberately. When growth slows, they look outward, to global conditions, to larger powers, to structural unfairness, rather than inward at incentives and execution. Lee would say that this mindset weakens agency. He would also observe that national ambition has softened. Neither country articulates a clear vision of what it must become indispensable for in the coming decades. Comfort has replaced necessity as the organizing principle. Without necessity, ambition diffuses. Without ambition, strategy becomes reactive. Lee would likely point out that both Australia and New Zealand underinvest in long-term state capacity. Infrastructure projects are delayed. Skills development is fragmented. Strategic industries are discussed but not systematically built. These failures are not dramatic enough to provoke outrage, but they are consistent enough to shape outcomes. He would also warn that demographic change will sharpen these weaknesses. Aging populations increase fiscal pressure. Younger generations face higher housing costs and lower relative opportunity. When upward mobility slows, social trust erodes. Trust erosion undermines the very cohesion both countries pride themselves on. Another area of concern for Lee would be regional positioning. Asia is becoming more competitive, not less. Proximity to growth centers is an advantage only if engagement is deep and strategic. Australia and New Zealand often engage Asia economically while remaining culturally and politically distant. This limits integration and reduces influence. Lee believed proximity without integration is wasted opportunity. Singapore succeeded not because it was near Asia, but because it embedded itself into regional and global systems. Australia and New Zealand, by contrast, often act as observers rather than architects of regional structures. He would also caution that reliance on historical goodwill is risky. International systems evolve. Strategic patience toward peripheral players diminishes as competition intensifies. Countries that do not actively shape their relevance find that others shape it for them. Lee would emphasize that shared future does not mean shared destiny. Australia and New Zealand still have agency, but agency requires coordination. Separate, each country is small relative to global competitors. Together, they could achieve scale in research, innovation, defense capability, and market access. Yet political will for deep integration remains limited. He would see this reluctance as symptomatic of comfort. Integration requires surrendering some autonomy for greater collective capacity. Comfortable societies resist such trade-offs. Lee would argue that sovereignty without relevance is hollow. He would also warn against confusing global admiration with strategic leverage. Being liked is not the same as being needed. International systems prioritize necessity over sentiment. Australia and New Zealand are often praised for values, but values alone do not secure influence when competition sharpens. Lee's alarm would therefore focus on timing. He would say both countries are still early enough in the process to change course without crisis. That window will not remain open indefinitely. Once relative decline becomes visible, reform becomes harder and more divisive. He would urge leaders in both societies to act before public pressure forces their hand. Leadership, in his philosophy, exists to anticipate discomfort, not to wait for it. Waiting for consensus is often another form of delay. Ultimately, Lee would frame the shared future of Australia and New Zealand as a test of whether prosperous democracies can rediscover urgency without fear, whether they can choose discipline over comfort voluntarily, whether they can reform before necessity makes reform unavoidable. He would conclude that their future will not be determined by geography, alliances, or history. It will be determined by whether they accept that success is not a permanent condition. It must be rebuilt continuously. That is the alarm Lee Kuan Yew would sound, not because Australia and New Zealand are failing, but because they are drifting together into a future that rewards speed, scale, and execution more ruthlessly than the past ever did. He would likely urge them to think regionally as well as nationally. Separately, each faces limits of scale. Together, they could deepen integration in skills, capital, infrastructure, and innovation. But integration requires political will and long-term vision, both difficult to sustain without pressure. Lee would conclude with a familiar warning. The most dangerous moment for successful societies is when they believe their success is self-sustaining. History, he would say, does not punish countries for being immoral. It punishes them for being slow. Australia and New Zealand still have time. But time, in Lee Kuan Yew's thinking, is valuable only if used. If not, it quietly runs out. That is the alarm he would sound, not of impending failure, but of a narrowing future shaped by choices not yet made.